Welcome to this afternoon's discussion about the role of Russia in contemporary politics, where we'll focus on the impact of Russia on energy security in Europe and Russian migration in the European context. These two themes might seem that they don't really go together, but they do here at Forest, because those are two of the most important themes for us. We're organizing this afternoon together with our Finnish think tank friends E2 and under the umbrella of the European Liberal Forum, where we both part. Now, when I look out at the people here, I see roughly 1/3 people that come here often. You must know that you are the extended family of Forest. We're always grateful to see you. I see roughly 1/3 that we see fairly often, and when we do see you, we know that this time it was particularly relevant. We're very pleased and thankful for that. And then there's 1/3 that we have very rarely, or if ever, seen at Forest before. We're glad that you found us relevant this time. We hope that it's the beginning of a new cooperation and a new exchange of ideas. And especially for you, let me tell you just a little bit about Forest and what a think tank is. Forest is the Forum for Reforms, Entrepreneurship and Sustainability. A think tank that next year is going to celebrate its 10th birthday. A think tank that is there to help improve decision making, help bridge the divide between the research and the policymakers. This also means that when we're going to discuss Russia this afternoon, contrary to what many people have asked me, this is not a conference that's for or against Russia as such. It's a conference much in line with so many other of the seminars that you who often come here have witnessed, where we say, well, we're curious. You've seen many of the Nyfiken på conferences that Forest has had. We're curious, this time we're curious about this very big neighbor of ours, where we realize that many of us are not well aware of their climate and energy policies, or their investments in the energy sector, or how that influences us and neighboring countries. And when it comes to migration, I'm sure that not all of us were aware of Russia being the second largest country in terms of migrants, second only to the US, which means that probably there's also reason to discuss that more in detail. We're going to have a discussion over the next 2 hours, rounding up. Obviously, it's Friday afternoons. We hope you have time to stick around a little bit to discuss this more over a glass of something or something to chew on. But before that, we're going to divide it into roughly 3 parts. The first part is the energy sector, where we ask our very own Hanna Stenegren to give us an introduction to the theme. And after that, we focus a little bit on the Russian gas sector and European dependency with Chloé. We will then have a short panel discussion where we welcome your questions and brief interventions. And then the second part will be the Russian migration, where our very own Minna Ljunggren will give us an introduction, and then Leonid Polishchuk will give us a more in detail look on the Russian migration policy. And then again, we'll have a Q&A session and a brief discussion. And then thirdly, we'll bring everyone up here to sort of try and bridge the divide between these two themes and bring up some other themes and ideas that we might have within this wonderful group that we gathered this afternoon. But first of all, as I mentioned, we are doing this at Forest together with our dear Finnish think tank friends E2. The initiative was yours, so I want you to both introduce E2. A lot of us don't know you, and also give us a brief introduction to the theme. Please, Jussi, Westinen, welcome.
Yes, thank you, Mattias. Good afternoon to everyone here. It's a pleasure to be a part of this seminar. My name is Jussi Westinen. I'm a researcher in E2, the Finnish think tank, and I have a background in electoral research. I've been conducting the national election studies for the 2 latest parliamentary elections. Our important and topical theme today, as Mattias mentioned, is the role of Russia in contemporary politics. A week ago, we organized a similar seminar in Helsinki in cooperation with the think tank Magma and Svenska Bildningsförbundet. I want to thank Forest for organizing this event here today. It looks like a really intriguing program. So why did we launch seminars on this issue? Well, the relationship between European Union and Russia is perhaps more challenging today than it has been in decades. The situation in Ukraine and its consequences has reduced dialogue between EU and Russia, and also between single member countries and Russia. In addition, the situation in Syria and Turkey has its impact on the relationships. Energy policies, which is a major theme today, is also a topic that comes up frequently in the news and in the political agenda. And these themes are closely intertwined with the future of the EU. Of course, as a Finnish think tank, we had a special interest in choosing Russia for this project, since the Russians constitute the largest minority with immigrant background in Finland. There are about 75,000 people with Russian background in Finland, and they constitute about 1.5% of the total population. And the second biggest minority with immigrant background are the Estonians. And also that it has been anticipated that the number of Russians would be growing in Finland, so that emphasizes the theme from our perspective. Because of the current situation, it is extremely important to closely follow the development in Russia and to create a knowledge-based understanding, since Russia is an inseparable part of our surroundings. Since E2 is a research-oriented think tank, last year we've conducted mostly research on the values and attitudes of the Finnish people, and also the societal climate. We want to generate knowledge and improve ways to share knowledge among different sectors in society, from research to politics and vice versa. In our Helsinki seminar last week, there were 4 MPs and 3 scholars that discussed Russia from different angles, and the discussions revolved much around economy, which was one of our main areas of interest in Helsinki seminar. Not myself an expert in this topic, but I bring you here some points that were mentioned in Helsinki. It has been frequently stated that the Russian economical attention would have shifted to Asia. However, the link between Russia and Western Europe is still crucial. Half of Russia's export go to Western Europe, and half of imports come from there. Therefore, it is important to predict how the Russian economy develops. Another myth is that we often think in Europe that the Russian economy is weaker than it actually is. Russia has various strategies to survive, and it is not on its knees. It has vast natural resources that it can rely on, but the question is for how long, because Russia hasn't excelled in renewing its economy. Russia's capital stock hasn't grown since the 1970s, and Russian labor force is shrinking faster than in other countries, fundamentally because of lower natural fertility, even though immigration is balancing it. Another challenge is to increase aggregate productivity. It is quite easy for a relatively poor country to become richer just by imitating others, and that is what happened at the beginning of the 21st century in Russia, but it was evaluated that it is much harder for a wealthy country to become innovative. And it was stated that it seems that Russia is a bit stuck between low-cost countries of Asia and high-tech Europe. There's a clear target in Russia to make it a high-tech society, but very little action has taken place since the decision-making is a bit complicated. During the last 15-20 years, very few patents have been obtained in Russia. What follows is that Russia's share in global production is prognosed to decrease slowly, and although it has benefits from oil, gas and minerals, it is hard to become economically feasible since new technology is required. In the short run, it makes sense of utilizing a large domestic market, but by doing so, you remain out of the international production chains. From outside, it is interesting to observe how Russia copes, but certainly not from inside. Professor of Practice Pekka Sutela from Lappeenranta University of Technology stated in our seminar. At a general level, the relationship between Russia was described as uneasy, complicated, not normal, stressful, and multi-layered. Russia was characterized as an actor that manages to adopt strategies that surprise other actors. It has its own special way of handling international relations. Russia requires a deep understanding. We need to have urge and motivation to understand it better. As Member of Parliament Matti Vanhanen, the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee in the Finnish Parliament, concluded, it is worrying that so many young people in Finland don't see Russia attractive at all, neither in business nor in interaction at large. The share of people in school writing Russian language in matriculation examination has been about 2% of the total number of students. And what is a good sign is that it has been increasing during the last decade, but still it's smaller than, for example, the amount of students writing Spanish language. And it is quite concentrated to the east. The interest is quite concentrated to eastern parts of Finland and perhaps also the capital area. I was born and raised myself in southern Karelia, a region in southeastern Finland that has a border with Russia, and I've seen the variation in attitudes and in interaction myself. Whatever the circumstances, it is certain that we cannot be indifferent about Russia. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jussi, both for that introduction and also for telling us about the conclusions that you already made at the previous week's seminar, much along the same lines. Now, the next speaker, she spent 6 years at the European Parliament working with energy independence and working with renewable energy before she joined us here at FOES as the Assistant Director for the Program for Climate and Environment, where a lot of the part of the time she spent with the 2030 Secretariat for a Fossil Independent Transport Sector. So it makes a lot of sense to ask Hanna Stenegren to look at fossil independence in relation to the big neighbor in the East. Hanna, welcome.
Thank you, Mattias. Yes, energy security really returned to the forefront of the European energy policy agenda when the crisis in Ukraine erupted in early 2014. And the resulting soured relationship between Russia and the West has intensified the view that ongoing dependence on Russian energy exports makes the EU both economically and strategically vulnerable, and that a key energy security objective should be to reduce Russia's role in supplying Europe energy needs. And during this time, we at FORES got curious about this new role of energy security. So we made 2 studies together with other European think tanks. One with focus on more energy security and reduced emissions, and the other more focused on transports. And we have them here in the back, so you could have a look at them after this seminar. And already in the early 2015, the Commission launched its plan for the Energy Union as one of the 10 political priorities of the then new Juncker Commission. And these 5 dimensions of the Energy Union are closely interlinked. So you can see at the top there is energy security, but then you also have an integrated European energy market, energy efficiency, decarbonizing the economy, and research, innovation, and competitiveness. And the Commission has since then rolled out a number of legislative proposals on all of these dimensions. And I will go into a little bit more the ones that are most focused on energy security. But as you know, and as you will see, all of these are very closely interlinked. So already in 2014, energy security stress tests were carried out, And they simulated energy supply disruptions scenarios of Russian gas imports during either 1 month or 6 months. How would the EU withstand if that happened? And these stress tests showed that a prolonged supply disruption would have a substantial impact on the EU, not very surprisingly. And in particular, Eastern EU countries would be affected. But this also showed that if the EU countries cooperate more with each other in the energy areas, the consumers could still remain supplied. So this led to a number of measures, both short term and in the medium and long term. I'm going to stay there. So on the right side of this box, you could see the long-term measures. So here, energy efficiency and reaching the proposed 2030 energy and climate goals are very much in focus. And in particular, there's a focus on buildings and industry, because in the EU overall, buildings use 40% of total energy in the EU, while industry use about 25%. And there's also been a lot of focus on helping consumers to lower their energy consumption. For example, through clear billing information and smart energy meters, which is quite, for us in Sweden and Finland, in the Nordic countries, it's quite, we're already doing it, but in a lot of European countries, this is not done. Also, increasing energy production in the EU and diversify supply countries and routes has been a big focus. And this, for example, includes further deployment of renewables and something that the European Commission calls sustainable production of fossil fuels. I think that could be discussed if that is possible. I don't think we would agree here that that is something that is possible. But also safe nuclear energy where that is being used, because in this context we need to understand that even though the European Union, the European Commission, the European Council and the European Parliament, they are doing a lot and doing a lot of legislation, but one really important thing here to keep in mind is that the energy mix of every member state, that is decided by the member states themselves. The EU cannot say that you should have this much nuclear or this little coal, so that is always something. When we talk about energy on a European level, there's always this struggle between the member states wanting to keep their say in their energy mix and the EU institutions wanting to push for example, more clean energy. And then a few other of these measures are to complete the internal energy market and build missing infrastructure, to build the links better, and to speak with one voice in external energy policy. There's been a big focus, for example, in the gas, what do you call it, when you have a gas, for example, with the Gazprom and the country, what is it called, gas contracts. There's been an attempt for the EU Commission to be more involved and to have greater transparency when these contracts are being made, so that it's more transparent what one country, what price they actually get compared to what another country actually gets. So there's been a lot of things happening in this area during these years, and since this hasn't been so much to do with Sweden, in particular these gas measures, it didn't get very much attention here, but there's got a lot going on. And looking at EU imports, EU imports more than half of the energy it consumes to a cost of more than 1 billion euros a day. So what is the euro now? 9 crowns, so like 9 billion crowns a day. Is that, if someone knows math better than I, is that correct? Yeah. So it's quite a lot. And And also, as we just described, several measures are being taken at the EU level, but we also, when we are discussing energy security in Europe, it is very important to put in context the nature of the EU's energy import dependence, which varies between different countries and among different fuels. And Chloé will go into gas more after, so I will give you an overview of the three biggest fossil fuels, so coal, gas, and oil. So as you can see, the EU hasn't really gotten less dependent on energy imports. It's rather increased.
May I ask one question? Is it due to the new member states or because of other things in Spain?
That's a very good question. Let's save that for the panel when we have our expert Chloé here too. And if you look at the different fuels, as you can see, oil is the biggest source of is the fuel where we have the biggest dependency by imports, about 90%, and then natural gas is about 66%. But you can also see here that also a big part of Europe's coal consumption is supplied by imports as well.
Which year?
This is 2012, 2013. And yeah. And just to illustrate here that you can see Russia is the biggest, we rely on Russia most in all of these, both coal, gas, and oil. But even though, as we said, that we actually import more oil, but due to the more flexible nature of the global oil markets, that's why the European energy security focus more on the security of natural gas, and this is also because many European gas markets are dependent on just one supplier. And Chloé will also go into more detail on this, so I will leave it at that. But as you can see, there are several countries that are completely dependent on Russian gas for their gas supply.
Question, the LNG, the gas, and so on, for the state, and that's not in those figures because this is 2012. Do you have any comment on that?
I don't have any comment on that. Let's also save that question for the panel to see if Chloé could maybe have an answer on that. I'm not an expert in this, just giving you the EU perspective and the figures that I found on this. But it's a really interesting question. So let's put it. I'll have Chloé think about it, and let's get back to it. So to conclude, I just want to raise 5 points of what could be done to get away from this situation, the dependency, in particular on Russia. So we got into it a little bit already, to diversify the sources of energy imports, both when it comes to gas, because we need to remember a lot of the European countries. So I know that this graph is impossible to read, and that's not what I want you to do. This is not to test your eyesight. So basically, what you need what you can need to keep in mind here is what I want to show with this picture is that the first red bar to the left, that is coal, and then you have the orange one is oil, and then you have the light blue one is gas. So just, is there a pointing thing with this? Maybe the first one? That one? Yeah, perfect. Den där. Perfect. So just to compare, for example, this is Sweden, and this is Poland. So the energy mix looks very different in different countries, and as you can see, gas, the light blue one, is still a big factor in European energy policy. So looking into LNG capacity, for example, is something that is done in several member states, and on a European level as well. But that is mostly done in the Baltic region, but also in the West. Not so much in the Southeast Europe, which still remains the most heavily dependent on Russian gas supply. And we can also increase the domestic production. And here we're talking both about renewables. We have climate and energy targets, among which renewables is a big one. Improving energy efficiency, another big one that we went into already. And here electrification of the transport sector is going to be really important as well as production of biofuels within the EU, which can also get us away from the oil dependency. And then the last point, to facilitate an integrated energy market. And as I'm sure you've all heard of, this so-called winter package, or the clean energy package, which were released a year ago, is right now discussed among the EU institutions. So with that, I'll give the word back to Mattias.
Thank you so much for the time being, Hanna. And I was glad to hear that there was questions already. Now what we want to do with the questions is that we want you to wait for the microphone, because we have so many people following this on the Facebook site, and so many people are going to go back to the recordings afterwards. So after we've heard Chloé Lecoq as well, we're going to have a microphone for those questions, which also means that it's going to be easier for the others here to actually hear that question. So please save those questions, write them down on the palm of your hand or wherever you want to put them. And also, if you feel that you have an interesting question or an additional comment, please use the hashtag Fores on the Twitter site, the Twitter account that we use. If you use the hashtag Fores, I will be able to find the question right in my pocket. So even if you feel that you're too shy to ask it, I'll do that for you. This also means that this is a relevant way for you if you want to comment on what you hear, if you want to put pictures of us out there on the internet. That's wonderful. So next in line, Chloé Lecoq, you are the program associate professor. I got it right the third time around. Associate professor of economics at the Stockholm School of Economics site, and you have been looking a lot of on the gas dependency situation. So please tell us all about it, Chloé.
Thank you. Hi everyone, and it's a great pleasure to have 10 minutes to talk about this important issue of Russian gas dependency and Europe. In Europe, or for Europe, okay? And thank you, Forrest, for giving me this opportunity to talk about my research that I'm doing currently with Elena Paltsova, who is also at the Stockholm School of Economics. Okay, so first when Mattias asked me to talk about Russian gas dependency, it was just this title, and I thought, hey, I only have 10 minutes, it's a lot. And also a lot to say, just talk about this, because yes, it is. As Anna mentioned, we are dependent on Russian gas, that's it. But it's rather short time to just say, okay, is it a problem? And should we do something about it? So that's why I decided to choose this a little bit provocative question, because I want to convince you that there's not an easy answer. So again, I will share my talk into 3 sub-questions. The first is, which is important, as soon as we talk about gas dependency, it is important to agree on the measure, like always for any type of question. How to measure this Russian gas dependency? And Anna has been showing some number, and that it's important to understand those numbers and also to understand how this measure is made. The second question is whether given this measure, we should reduce Russian dependency, and how? Again, what can we do about this? And the third point is, if we agree that there is dependency, there is some tool to reduce such dependency, I also would like to discuss shortly about how much we should reduce this dependency. So, first question, how to measure Russian dependency? I've been working a lot with Elena on this issue because, indeed, I just want to convince you that this is not so easy. Of course, we can and we should look at import dependency, right? So, but in some sense, as Hanna mentioned already, every member state has their own energy profile, and there's like an own energy mixed. But if you just look at import dependency, so this graph is just showing how the share of non-EU net import in energy consumption. And what is important is for you, the pointer is, I'm sorry, the big one, logic. And then, so what is important, I want you to keep in mind that the blue is the oil, the red is the gas, and the coal is the green. So if you really quickly look and try to understand this import dependency by fuel, if you only take this picture, you may think, hey, we should care much more about oil than gas. So that's the first conclusion from this graph. However, as already Hanna mentioned, now let's be a little bit more specific. Let's make sure that indeed you want to control not only the share of import, but you want also to take into account the number of suppliers that you're facing. So can I only buy from Russia, or can I buy from France? Can I buy from Netherlands? And this idea that you have some option and you're not locked in with one supplier, that's going to be crucial indeed to decide whether this dependency is a problem or not. And again, because oil is so liquid, the oil market is so liquid, indeed, you're not so concerned about this import dependency. And so you can do some exercise and calculate some index where you do take into account the market share of each energy supplier in your energy consumption portfolio. And in some sense, you obtain a different figure, right? So from this figure, from this important import dependency ratio, you have something that is a little bit different for each member state. And what is important now is that indeed the red figure is much more higher. So basically, this is an index that we calculate, and I don't have time to explain how we calculate this index, but what is important is to say that, okay, if you're only facing one supplier, you can only buy from one supplier, then your dependency is really crucial, even if you don't buy so much, right? And of course, and this I'm going to show you another diagram that is almost the same. It's like now, if you're only focusing on one supplier for Europe, which is Russia, and here, as Hanna already showed you this one, that the European Union is not so much dependent in total on the Russian gas, but indeed some countries are really dependent. And I want to mention that, okay, there is the eastern part, but there are also quite big countries also, like Germany, that depends on Russia. So this is the first point I want to make. Dependency might be important, but when you talk about dependency or Russian gas dependency, you should take into account on the number of supplier. And the second point, you should also take into account in which route you can have those gas, right? And our point, and this is also a work with Elena, where our idea was that indeed, if you have access, we're talking about the same supplier, but if you can import Russian gas with different route, then obviously your dependency is not so crucial. It's not so dramatic. And this is important if you think of all the issue and the conflict that Russia had with Ukraine and Belarus, is that indeed what happened is that if one route is blocked because of political conflict, if one route one route is closed, then you can always import with another route. And I don't want to mention too much, but we have calculated a new index where we take into account this grid, okay? And indeed, Germany was pushing a lot for Nord Stream, and although Germany is buying a lot from Russia, the fact that Germany had access to a direct route was also important in the decision. So, not surprising, if you do, again, not only focusing on import dependency per se, but also take into account the route, the gas route, then, again, you obtain that some countries are quite stuck with Russia, and also, while other countries, the top countries here, they have much more option to import gas. So that was my first question, how to measure this dependency. The second question is like, what to do about this dependency? So yes, there is some dependency. What are the options for Europe? So Hanna mentioned a little bit, but LNG, yes, this is big, and they are building a lot of LNG right now. So going from gas pipeline to LNG, that's one option. And we maybe discuss this in the panel discussion later on, because there's a price issue here. LNG gas costs much more. The second point is the reverse flow. So indeed, the big problem that I mentioned with the route is because it used to be that indeed when you were in Romania, Hungary, it was difficult. You were really dependent on Ukraine to import your gas. Now, if you allow reverse flow, in some sense, if you allow here Germany, if you allow that Germany could buy the gas from Russia and sell it back to the other country, avoiding Ukraine, for example, then Europe will only need to negotiate with Russia and not take into account this transit risk. So that's one thing that Europe has been developing, is to really push for this reverse flow capacity. And the third option is to build gas pipeline. So let me just remind you that there was that two project. That was the South Stream project, when Russia really wanted to have a new gas pipeline, avoiding Ukraine, and some European countries were part of this new pipeline that was cancelled in December 2014. And there was this Nabucco, where the idea was really to exclude Russia, to avoid completely Russia. And I want to mention two things about Nabucco and why South Stream pipeline. So choosing South Stream, for example, even if it was cancelled, deciding to build up a gas pipeline, gas pipeline, the problem is that people argue that that will not solve the issue, because indeed you will increase dependency, gas dependency. So you will increase the share of the ratio. However, people argue that yes, but if you don't care so much about the share, but you care about more the transit risk, having one extra route will reduce this transit risk. But also, and this is going to be my last point, is that by buying to Russia, we also are a big buyer as a EU. So we have some buyer power. And that's going to be my third point here. And my third question is that, yes, we have some Russian gas dependency. We have some tools to diversify, to make sure that we reduce this dependency. But the third point is that should we go all the way? Should we really be fully independent from Russian gas? Well, first it might be really costly. But the second point I want to make is I think EU, it is good to remember that EU accounts for 60% of Gazprom revenue from gas sale. Okay? And Russia also wants to sell his gas. So indeed, EU has some buyer power. And it is important that if EU exercises bargaining power, then you may not be so worried about the dependency. So, because otherwise, Russia, as Jussi mentioned already, is also is going to also, and still is doing this right now, diversify the demand. So it's not just EU that is now playing and try to diversify its energy supply. It's also Russia that is obviously looking for other consumer. So there's been some deal. I'm sure you've read about this. So the Atli gas pipeline, where really here we see that Russia is moving towards Asia. And it's fine. But that means that EU is also going to lose some bargaining power. Because if Russia is coming and increasingly trying to sell gas on the Asian side, then indeed Asian consumer and European consumer are going to compete. And this is also the case with Turk Stream, even though we think Europe will benefit with this new Turk Stream pipeline. There's been some, but it's an open question because Turkey has said that it will be served first, right? So obviously, Turkey is not just a transit country, it will also buy gas from Russia. So in conclusion, should Russian gas dependency be a concern for Europe? Of course, it is a concern, but it all depends how you measure it. And it is a concern for one part of Europe, obviously, but it's changing now with the reverse flow and with the diversification of route. And second, there is means to reduce Russian gas dependency. You want to you could diversify the energy supply, you can diversify the routes. But maybe one caveat is that you want to reduce dependency to some extent. But you need to be aware that you should keep enough Russian gas to have some bargaining power. Thank you.
Thank you, Chloé. Please stick around. And Hanna, please come back up. Thank you for those insights, Chloé. And I want to start by asking you both, actually. The dependency on Russian gas and to some extent oil, can we define that, the dependency, how much of a problem is it that it's Russian and how much is it that is just from one country?
I would say just one country. I don't think, I mean, you know, there's one big player and then one big producer. So the problem is that whether now if we start to import or that LNG is getting interest and increasing their market share, Russia will also negotiate. We see that as soon as Europe is trying to talk with one voice and Europe try to exercise his market power, it's no issue. So I think this is just a story about one big supplier and one big consumer, but quite diversified inside.
I'm thinking also maybe, Hanna, when we look at the Swedish situation, even though this is a European Liberal Forum meeting, it's hosted by us, we're in Sweden. Swedish dependency on Russian oil is 42% of the oil that's consumed in Sweden. We sometimes perceive Russia as something that we might need to defend ourselves against. Do you see a security perspective that's dependent on this being Russia, or do you agree that the main issue here that it's one big supplier?
I definitely think it's both, because I think we wouldn't be this concerned if that big supplier was Norway. So how it behaves, how the country behaves has big political impacts as well. So I would definitely say that this country being Russia has political dimensions.
On the other hand, and with what we heard from Chloé, the bargaining power that you get when you buy a lot is interesting, and you've been 6 years at the European Parliament. Do you see anyone making good use of this bargaining power?
What I saw during those 6 years, I was working on energy issues and climate issues in the European Parliament Energy Committee, and there were several long meetings, and they were mostly about concerns that the European Commission felt that they had no insight. It wasn't transparent. These contracts that I mentioned before between, for example, Gazprom and individual countries, there were no transparency. So the feeling from the European Commission side was that we need more influence, we need more insight in order to make better deals. So from their perspective, they didn't feel so much having bargaining power.
And staying with the European Union and the ongoing discussions about the renewable energy package and the whole winter package, you said rightfully so that there is no such thing as a European joint decision on how much you can import from any one country. But how much within the European Union energy context, how much is energy security and security overall taken into account?
And by security overall, you mean?
The security issues of being dependent on one supplier and that one supplier being Russia.
That's a good question. Energy security, I think it's both, but in different ways. So there's both the concerns that some Eastern European countries have. It's cold in the winter. They want to know that they will have heat in their houses and there's no gas pipe that could be switched off. So it's that concern, but there's also supply disruption concern, for example, industry. We know in Sweden how important it is that our industry have energy that is not interrupted. So I would say it's both, and it looks very different in different countries which concern there's most, and that also comes into, as you mentioned, Mattias, also the climate and the climate issue. That this focus on being less dependent on other countries and maybe Russia in particular, we focus on indigenous energy sources. So, for example, we have Poland. They have a lot of coal reserves. So, with pointing the hand to hey, energy security, we should become less dependent on Russia. We have this huge resource of coal in our country. Let's use it. So sometimes the climate concerns and the energy security perspective, yeah, exactly, they kind of crash.
Clash.
Yeah.
In just a second, I want to open up the floor. Oscar has a microphone. You just do the international sign for a question. There's one, two already. Just hold on to that thought. I'll ask Chloé one more question, and I want to tell you about the microphone, the way it works. You speak into it. Nothing more than that. Oscar is going to make sure it's turned on. You don't need to turn it around or flip any switch or anything. Don't do it. Just talk into it. In a second, you get the word. Chloé, your perspective was primarily or really strictly on the energy supply and the energy security of issues. When you add a layer of climate concerns and indeed the climate targets that's being discussed at the European Union, does that lead you in any different direction?
No, so you add one target. So of course climate change is important, but indeed if you want to reduce or achieve some climate goals, then you need to buy for some country much more gas and coal. So there is here a trade-off, and each country has to make or decide on this trade-off, right? And this is what is happening in Poland. Again, Poland, it's becoming cheaper and much more affordable for Poland to produce with coal than with buying gas. But yeah, so there are trade-offs. But I think the issue here is that in Europe, and it's no news for anyone, is that every country is different, and it is you could imagine that there could be complement and build the one union, but it is just as in other field, in other matter, it is really difficult to have one energy policy. And you saw this when there was this big discussion on Nord Stream and how Poland was so upset that that Germany agreed to build on Nord Stream. So that was also something. I think it's just one extra route. So I still think that it's really difficult to build one energy union.
I think a lot of us really learned a lot from your three very relevant questions. But the third question, I would like you to just come a little bit closer to an answer. How much should we really reduce that dependency? And I guess there's one answer for the European Union as a whole, but I would love for you to focus most on our close neighbors, that several of them are at 100%. Maybe you could say that gives them tremendous bargaining power. I think maybe not. What level would be sustainable from a security point for them?
But I think Europe has been improving also, and I think you should, if we had really an energy union that works, in a sense you have reverse flow, it would be no problem it would be no problem that Eastern Europe just buy from Germany. So it has to work. It has to work as one unit, and that's the challenge for me. So I understand, I see why Eastern Europe is nervous depending so much on Russian gas, but if you have trade within Union, I don't think that should be an issue.
Thank you. We're all getting close to the middle age here, which means that we need memory training. So what we're going to do is we're going to take 1, 2, 3 questions at once. We're going to try and remember them, and then we're going to get the great answers from you. You first.
Okay, my name is Per Bretham. I have a background in political science and intellectual property law and new technologies. My question is, when we talk about Russia, you can't disregard the oil and gas factor and all the oil dependency. But how, if at all, invested is Russia in developing new energy resources, new techniques? China's a little bit on the way. And are they only pushing for the gas, or are they trying to renew?
Great question. Keep that in mind. Move the mic to our dear friend there.
My name is Leonid Ljunggren. I work with renewable energy, bioenergy. And my first question is, trade is good. So it's good for Europe that we trade with Russia. It's good for Russia that Russia trades with Europe. That must be one important thing. So what we want is not to be dependent, but we want to have the trade ongoing. There are very, very different situations in different countries, of course. But renewables are increasing very, very fast. Go back to coal is not an issue. Maybe in a bargaining situation a long time. But otherwise, look for wind development, look for bioenergy development. It's increased very fast. So some countries are slow. That is their wrongdoing. They should be doing better. Then they would not be so much dependent. Third thing I want to say is, if Europe should not import from Russia, from where should Europe import? Qatar.
Thank you. And third and final question for this round.
My name is Annika Granlund, and I think there is a much more important question. I think it would be really tragic if we would substitute gas for coal or brown coal. And today, if I'm correctly informed, that oil has to go down to $10 a barrel to be able to compete with solar energy, because solar energy has become so incredibly cheap. And I think to getting rid of import dependency, Russian dependency, Saudi Arabia dependency, whatever, the best thing is to force the change to clean energy. And that is future-proof, and we can't sacrifice our survival for reducing dependency of one country or another, but we should be self-sufficient, and we should invest in green energy.
Thank you so much for those comments and questions. Chloé, your thoughts?
Yes, thank you everyone for the question. In terms of investment in new technology in Russia, I'm not sure actually. So I know they're talking about, but investing in renewable. But I have to say I don't know about the numbers. So I agree, of course, with the second point that trade is good, and then if you believe in market, the price should be enough to give the right incentive, and also it's important that the time are changing. Yes, renewable become cheap as well. So, and solar costs are decreasing, and to some extent wind power plant as well. So I think there's going to be options. So if you can diversify your energy portfolio, that will be the best way to protect or reduce your risk exposure toward Russia. So again, buying from Russia is not an issue. It's more that you have to make sure that you have different options available. And this is what is happening right now with the renewables. I think that's important. The third point, I agree with you. Yes, we would love to have renewable energy. That may be the best also to achieve target. And given that the cost is decreasing, there's full of trade-off here. Hanna showed you this huge diagram about all the targets. That's always nice graph, but we all know that you have to choose to weight those targets. So I want to say that so far as I understand the technology right now, you cannot, the battery are not big enough to save electricity. So when the wind is not blowing or the sun is not shining in our countries, maybe in Africa it's easier, but here it's really difficult, then you need the backup technology. And one of the backup technology is to use gas power plant or coal power plant. This is what Germany has done for a long time. Yeah, and it's increasing, and because of subsidies and so on.
Before letting Hanna in, let me just briefly myself also answer a little bit about renewables in Russia. This summer I was in Murmansk, meeting with the renewable energy actors there, who say that they're starting to see a game change. Until very recently, when they were working primarily with wind, because these are great wind areas, they said that it was very hard because the oil and gas industry is very strong. They're starting to see a game changer now because doing more wind for the domestic market might mean being able to export more gas and oil to other markets and getting hard currency. And the other part, no, you can't come back. And the other part is interesting to see the Swedish interest, for instance, in terms of Scandinavian biogas, which Chairman Göran Persson, many of us will know, who've been looking for the biogas opportunities in the St. Petersburg region linked to the very giant farms there. And so there's certainly lots of opportunities still to be explored, and I'm grateful for Swedish industries that are starting to see that link. Hanna.
Yes, I'm happy you came in before me, because as Chloé said, I don't know so much about what's going on there, so it's great that you had some insight there. Sure, haven't seen that much if you compare to what's happening in India and China and the initiatives coming from there. We haven't seen much from Russia, who keeps more quiet. If things are going on, they're quiet, but it's good that some things are going on at least. When it comes to the second issue, yes, I also agree trade is good. We believe in markets here at Fores. Also, renewables are increasing very fast, and some countries are indeed slow. One thing there to keep in mind is the gas infrastructure. When you build a gas plant today, and many are looking, for many European countries, they are not looking, as we are here in Sweden, to shift from what we have now to renewables and to increase the share of renewables. They are looking to switch from coal to gas in order to reach their climate targets, because if you compare coal and gas, both are fossil, but coal is so much worse in terms of emission than gas. So many European countries are looking into either improving their current gas plants that they have, or to build new gas plants. And when you build a gas plant today, they stand for like 50, 60 years. So you have a lot of infrastructure and money in infrastructure that you want to keep working on those. And also, as the third question says, yeah, that would be great if we could just make sure that everyone should just go into renewable energy. That would be great. And that's the problem again. The European countries are they are keeping their energy mix because they can decide that themselves. They don't want to give that power to the EU. And if you look also the will, if we look here in Sweden, there's a will between 7 out of the 8 parties in the Swedish parliament, in Riksdagen. They agreed that Sweden should have ambitious climate goals. We should be in the forefront of this development. There is a business case, but there are several European countries that they don't have that will. If you look at Poland, for example, they are trying constantly to lower the climate target, to make sure that the EU climate target don't go so high, because they don't want to change. They have a huge coal production. They have a lot of coal workers, so they don't want to make that transition. And as always in European politics, everyone needs to be on board about the direction. But lucky enough, Sweden can go further if we want to. But to increase the lowest level, that is really, really difficult.
Thank you so much for that, Chloé. Thank you so much for that, Hanna. We saw that there was follow-up questions. We saw more people wanting to ask questions. That's why we have preferred with drinks and snacks after 4 o'clock. And we also realized that some of you are going to think that energy security and climate is one issue and migration is a totally different issue. For those of you who still think so, I really recommend the book that we just published on climate refugees, clearly linking the 2 targets. And also we see them as 2 paramount important issues to better understand our big neighbor to the east. So we're going to ask Minna Ljunggren to give us an introduction to the field of migration linked to Russia. Minna is the former state secretary on migration, and she's now the program director for migration and integration here at Forest. Minna.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm just going to make a really brief introduction here. The Russian Federation appeared on the world map as an independent state in 1991. While internal migration was present within the Soviet Union, the external migration regime during the Soviet era was the Iron Curtain. The term, the Iron Curtain, symbolizes the efforts of the Soviet Union to block itself and its satellite states from open contact with the West and non-Soviet controlled areas. This regime entailed closed borders in both directions. That means that there was not a whole lot of migration going on at all externally. But things have changed from those days, and today we have an expert here with us that is going to educate us regarding the migration situation in Russia, to and from Russia today. And it's my pleasure to welcome Mr. Leonid Polishchuk. You are a research fellow at the Institute for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Uppsala University. Welcome.
That's true. Thanks very much. Well, good afternoon. Thanks very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here and to talk to your think tank about the migration situation in today's Russia. I have a formidable task. I was asked to restrict myself to some 15 minutes presentation. I'll do my best to make good use of that time. And then, of course, there'll be plenty of room for questions, answers, and discussions. First of all, migration in Russia is a big deal. I mean, really a big deal. Mattias mentioned in his introduction, I believe, that Russia is the second largest migration country in the world after the United States. And on this chart, you see, these are quarterly data, and you see how migration to Russia and you can say immigration from Russia, blue line and red line, evolved over time. Presently, there are anywhere between 10 to 12 million foreign nationals on the Russian soil, which is large. It's about 8% of the country's population. And at the same time, of late, the number of people who were leaving Russia for various reasons was also increasing. First thing I would like to discuss with you is who is coming to Russia. There were, over the period of, after the breakup of the Soviet Union, there were several distinct waves of migration to Russia. The first one occurred in the 1990s, and that was the time when ethnic Russians living in the former Soviet republics other than Russia, many of them were coming back to Russia. Again, for various reasons, and we're talking about 3 million people. And this inflow of ethnic Russians to Russia after the breakup of the USSR was extremely important to maintain the Russian population from a steep decline, because 1990s was a time of economic austerity, hardship, political instability, life expectancy collapsed, and Russia would have faced with a steep decline of its population were it not for these several million ethnic Russians coming home. Now, the second wave, and much of that migration was from Central Asian republics and now countries, where there was a large Russian population, and they found the conditions after the independence of these countries not quite comfortable for them. Now, the second wave of migration that started in the late 1990s and continued over the next 10 years was again mostly from Russian neighboring countries, but this time there were ethnic nationals of these countries that were going to Russia as guest workers, primarily for economic reasons. It was a huge inflow of migrant labor, and it was coming primarily, as I said, from Russia's southern underbelly countries such as Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, and also quite a lot of these people were coming from southwest and west, that is from Ukraine and from Moldova. And last but not least, the third wave of immigration opened up after the Ukrainian crisis. And that time there were mostly refugees living the areas of conflict in Ukraine, and we're talking about several 100,000 people that were seeking Russia safe haven. And now many of them stay in Russia, although relatively few of these people are seeking full-fledged refugee status in Russia. Most of them want to stay in Russia just for a while until things get settled. Now, please have a look at this chart. First of all, what you see on the left-hand side is how the number of foreign nationals for different years evolved. And you can see that these numbers always fluctuate between somewhere 10 and 12 million people. Now, when it comes to countries that send most of their nationals to Russia, countries that clearly stand out are, where is it, Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan and Azerbaijan. And also, please have a look at Ukraine. And also, please pay attention to this jump of Ukrainian nationals in Russia between 2014 and 2015. And these are, of course, these refugees from Ukraine. These are so-called CIS countries, which are Commonwealth of Independent States. That's an obsolete name. But there are some other countries where people are coming from to Russia, not shown here. I should mention here Vietnam, China, Turkey, and even surprising as it sounds, North Korea. Migration from North Korea is not voluntary. It's not private, but in the Far East, there are some agreements with North Korean companies which export cheap Korean labor to work on Russian construction sites. How can we explain this huge migration flow, and I'm talking about mostly guest workers, as it is almost always the case with economics, there are demand and supply side forces. On the one hand, there is a demand pool, and that is that the Russian economy, which at least until late 2010, 2008, was growing quite rapidly. There was a stellar period of golden years for the Russian economy from 1999 until 2008, when the economy was growing with the average rate of 7%. So it was a little bit of an economic powerhouse. And there was a labor-deficient economy. For demographic reasons, Russian population was declining and was aging. Please have a look at this age and gender pyramid. Males on the left side, females on the right-hand side, on the age. And you see clear signs of aging. Life expectancy in Russia was improving until recently, but it's still fairly low by international standards. Male life expectancy today is 62 years, and overall it's 72 years. And because of these demographic changes, there was an acute labor shortage in the Russian economy. And on the left-hand side, you see mortality rates per 1,000 and birth rates per 1,000. And you see that starting from this year, Russian natural increase of population is in the negative. So clearly, the economy needs lots of labor, and primarily cheap labor, labor which is not particularly educated. And this is precisely what migrants supplied. This is the supply push. Countries from where migrants were coming to Russia en masse in large numbers, in droves, were countries where economies were doing much worse than in Russia. For a variety of reasons, Central Asian economies were stagnating, and they were also burdened by demographic structures with a lot of young people coming of employment age and really unable to find any job. So quite naturally, these people moved to Russia. And remittances of their salaries back to their home countries are extremely essential for this country's economic situation. On this chart, you see that, for example, in the case of Tajikistan, one of the poorest countries in Central Asia, migrant remittances comprise almost 50% of the country's GDP. So these are large numbers. In some other countries, they're not as impressive, but as you can see in the case of Kyrgyzstan, it's 1/3, so on and so forth. So this is really a vital lifeline for this country's economies. Some of which are war-torn. As I said, there are also demographic problems. So quite obviously, we see strong supply push forces. Now, I was asked to talk a little bit about the migrants' condition and status. A majority of guest workers from southern neighbors of Russia are employed in construction, municipal services, retail, and somewhat less in agriculture. When you are in Moscow and St. Petersburg, and if you visit a fast food outlet, more likely than not, you'll be served by people from Central Asia. And these endless repairs and paving and repaving of Russian streets are also manned by people with darker skin and darker hair than usual Russians. And if you have a large construction site, oftentimes you see buses bringing people to that construction site early in the morning, taking them away later in the day. Now, migrants still find wages in Russia quite attractive and sufficient to justify the huge personal, social, and whatnot costs of working in a foreign country, although I should say that of late, there is an increasing outflow of migrants back from Russia to their home countries, which of course has to do with the economic crisis and the continued recession in the Russian economy. But their conditions are anything but admirable. They are paid low wages, and that's what makes them competitive. Their employee rights are not sufficiently protected. Wage arrears are quite common. Their housing conditions are usually poor, and oftentimes they do not have adequate access to healthcare and education, especially those who are employed unofficially, which by some estimates is about 50% to some extent. Although I should say that things are improving on that count. And more of these people are in Russia. Well, I have to explain what's the difference between being legal and being illegal in Russia. A large number of these migrants come to Russia taking advantage of the visa-free travel regime. Russia has a visa-free travel regime with most of its former Soviet neighbors. Exceptions are very few. I think it's Georgia and maybe a couple of other countries, even with Ukraine. Visa-free travel regime is still on. However, it allows foreign nationals to enter Russia, but it doesn't allow them to live in Russia and to work in Russia unless they go through some proper paperwork. And not everyone does it, and this is why there are quite a few illegal aliens in Russia. They enter to Russia legally, and that's the difference between, say, Russia and the United States. When Latinos cross the border illegally, and this is why Donald Trump wants this wall. Russia doesn't need a wall, at least yet, because these people are coming legally, but they stay on. However, and I will probably, that's precisely what I want to talk now, these people can relatively easily, hassle-free, to get a legal status in Russia. All it takes is to register with proper authorities, and also for some countries to get a patent that would allow you to be employed legally with no restrictions and strings attached for up to 1 year. Some countries which are in custom union with Russia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Armenia are exempt from these requirements. Migrants can become Russian citizens if they stayed in the country long enough. The requirement is 5 years, and of course legally, lawfully. And if again they go to some due process. And some people have fast-track access to Russian citizenship. These are those who were born or educated in the former Soviet Union and have Russian relatives. Also, asylum seekers have a reduced waiting time if they want to apply for citizenship. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that migrants, guest workers from the southern Russian neighbors, are excessively concentrated in two of Russia's capital cities, which is Moscow and St. Petersburg. In the city of Moscow alone, there are anywhere between 2 and 3 million migrants. And that's a city with a population of 1.5 times of Sweden, so it's a large city. But still, 2 million people, especially when these people are concentrated in particular areas, makes a big difference. It's 8% of the city's population. So much so that sometimes Moscow is called Moskva Bad, to mimic the names of Central Asian cities. And of course, that makes a visible difference. And on these photos, I'm not sure how clear it is, you see people praying during the holy time of Ramadan. There is a beautiful, newly built cathedral mosque in downtown Moscow, and I'm not quite sure if you see clearly how many people, but take my word, they're all tightly filled by migrants. And of course, the majority of these people are Muslim. Now, it would be amiss if I didn't mention public attitudes and sentiments about migration. From mid-1990s onwards, anti-immigrant sentiments, sometimes bordering xenophobia, were common in Russia. They were well captured by a number of reports and stories and movies. Those who have had any knowledge of Russian cinema might have heard about a great movie called Brat, and a saying of one of this movie's character, "You're not my brother," and an expletive that symbolizes public attitudes to many migrants. And not unlike in some parts of Sweden or some segments of the Swedish society, the idea of tightening visa regimes and setting up restrictions to migrants moving in the country are highly popular. Russia has its share of nationalist and xenophobic movements, and every once in a while they hold public rallies, not very widely attended. In fact, as we speak, there is a petition to Moscow city government to sanction yet another so-called Ruski March, Russian march, to protest against migration. These people are not viewed by the mainstream politicians as real political opponents, but some of their leaders are in jail serving various prison terms. Of course, many people in fact invoke the threat and fear of terrorism as one reason for anti-immigrant sentiments, and indeed in a number of terrorist attacks in Moscow and some other Russian cities, migrants from these countries more often than not, were unfortunately involved. Law enforcement officials routinely blame migrants for higher crime rate and for membership in criminal networks, and they tend to explain an increase in crime, at least in some parts, by migration. However, I should say that there are much fewer than before incidences and reports of police brutality and extortion from migrants that used to be rampant in the early 1990s, 2000s. Now it's matter-of-fact-ish. Police are polite, correct, although racial profiling is extremely widespread. But that's just a matter of, it's a fact of life. And I should also mention that the Russian bureaucracy, grassroots, has quite a bit improved. I should say improved a lot of late. And those migrants who want to go through proper processes and get the paperwork done usually can do it hassle-free. And one good outcome of that is that the process of migration to Russia these days is much more transparent and better measured than before. So these migration figures that I give you are pretty accurate because all of them come from official migration service and police sources, and a vast majority of migrants prefer to go through this paperwork, which is low cost, and save them lots of troubles. Let me say a few words about refugees in Russia. Now, Russia, neither the government nor the society do not quite welcome conventional refugees from conflict and war-torn areas such as Syria, Afghanistan, and other conflict zones. And on that count, Russia is not very dissimilar from some of its eastern neighbors, such as Poland, Hungary, and the Baltic states. Still, there are several thousand of refugees from Syria, but only a very small number of these people have received an asylum status in Russia. Quite a few people, again, we're talking about thousands, enter Russia using various channels in order to use it as a transit route to real safe havens, which would be this country, Germany, or the European Union more generally. And two entry points to the European Union from Russia are Russia's borders with Norway and Finland. There was a somewhat funny story. There is a border crossing between Norway and Russia that was popular among these asylum seekers, but there was some arcane provision that people cannot cross that border crossing on foot. You have to be using a vehicle, and of course these migrants had no cars, so they were buying bicycles for the only reason to cycle across the border and then drop the bicycle immediately afterwards. And local authorities were scrapping these bicycles upon on the other side of the border. What else? Oh yes, and of course, last but not least, an extremely large number of refugees from Ukraine. In 1 year only, Russia accepted over 250,000-60,000 people from Ukraine, and that flow continued for quite some time. And the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees praised Russia as a country that offered assistance to such a large number of people on a relatively short notice. Okay, well, I guess I'm almost used up my time. I spoke almost entirely about migration to Russia, just a few words about immigration out of Russia, which is a big issue in and of itself. Please have a look at this chart. It's in Russian. I didn't find an English version, but blue line is those leaving Russia. And red line, oh yes, well, those leaving Russia total. But this huge spike of outflow of people from Russia, most of it is migrants coming back to their foreign countries, because again, it's police statistics. And if someone has lived in Russia for more than 9 months, this person is deemed to be an official Russian resident. And when this person leaves Russia, then it's he or she is included in these statistics. When we're talking about Russian citizens proper leaving Russia, then we see that this number was very high still in the early 2000s. Then as the economy was improving and people were getting more and more optimistic about the Russian economy, society, future and whatnot, there was a decline. And now you see a little bit of an uptake of that number as well. And some people talk about a third or fourth whatnot wave of migration. It's not huge, but we're talking about some 50,000 people a year, give or take, leaving Russia. And who and why they are living overall from the last years of the Soviet Union, 1989, through 2015, that's the latest year I have data for, officially 4.5 million people have left Russia. But I told you that the statistics of migration to Russia is very reliable. Data on immigration from Russia is much less reliable. And why? Because a person, a Russian national, can leave Russia and leave Russia for good, or at least for some time, without being registered as someone who has immigrated. This person can keep his or her status with the Russian government, can keep his or her residency and whatnot, and as a result, such person will not be counted as a migrant, as an immigrant, I should say. And from that point of view, it's useful to match or cross-check this data by using foreign countries' sources. And that suggests that the number of those who have left Russia to various countries might be 3 or 4 times higher than what the statistics suggest. In the early 1990s, people were leaving Russia primarily for economic reasons. And at that time, a majority of these people were more mobile, more urbanized, better educated. So some 40% of the migration from Russia originated in the capital city of Moscow. Now, then economic growth reduced that flow, but from 2012 onwards, for a whole variety of social and economic reasons, including skepticism about the prospects of the Russian economy, low income, lack of trust in public institutions, and also limited opportunities as they are seen, especially by younger Russians, for upward mobility, you see an increase of people leaving Russia as well. And sadly, among those who leave Russia, these are bearers of human capital. They're younger, they're more professional, they're educated, more urbanized, and also this outflow, limited as it might have been, involves not just not just the capital cities, but other big cities as well. And in fact, one of the highest Russian regions were, in the terms of immigration, is Northwest. It's the part of Russia which neighbors the Scandinavian countries. I should say, in conclusion, that a very important phenomenon of modern world, not just Russian, but of course Russia first and foremost, is the Russian diasporas around the world. There are about 25 million people who can be considered as Russians. At least the definition, of course, is very fuzzy. But a good criterion, the best one actually, would be the native tongue, the first language, people whose Russian is their native language. Now, this Russian diaspora is measured around 25 million, so it's a large part of population, and these people are spread all over the world. The highest concentration of these diasporas are in some neighboring countries, such as Kazakhstan, Ukraine, and the Baltic states. In the country of Estonia, 30% of population are native Russian speakers. Large Russian diasporas driven by recent immigration is in Germany. We should certainly include the state of Israel as a part of the Russian world, where probably 1.5 million people are native speakers of Russian. You can find Russian diasporas in North America and all over the world. And it's become very prominent, in part because of the recent geopolitical changes, in part because of some problems that these people have in their everyday lives. So it's an important policy issue that deserves, I guess, a special discussion. Thanks.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting, and I learned a lot. I have a few questions, and I'm sure we have questions also from the audience. To start with the refugees, you told us a few things about refugees in Russia, and as you describe, Russia has not taken a great deal of responsibility for the latest refugee migration flows from Syria, for example.
True.
Are there any actions in this direction for another policy in Russia today, would you say?
Well, I don't think this is a really big policy issue in Russia these days, simply because the number of these people are relatively few. But there is a good number of prominent, high-profile cases. I should say that there is a number of Russian NGOs which are quite active in assisting refugees and asylum seekers from different countries. And these people do a really good job. They support these refugees in courts. Sometimes they're able to accomplish a stay of deportation orders. if deportation is inevitable, then at least they help these people to find safe haven out in some other countries, so they're not sent to their home countries, which oftentimes would be dangerous for them. So it is not a it's not a matter of high political importance in Russia these days, unlike, say, the situation with Ukrainian refugees, Ukrainian asylum seekers.
Another measure of how to the status of the refugee policies in the countries. Often, how is it possible for NGOs and other bodies to operate within the country? For example, UNHCR has an office in Moscow.
Presence in Moscow, right?
Do they operate there?
Absolutely.
Is it,
yes, right. They hold seminars. They have all sorts of public awareness activities. And they, of course, interact with these NGOs. There are also organizations of migrants, which are becoming more active and prominent than before. They're also stepping in public domain. So there is quite a number of organized forces that promote and support the migrants' cases. And as I said, although the situation with refugees overall is not very good, they've been able to accomplish quite a few successes. For example, there were incidences that were able to win cases in Russian courts, allowing these people to stay, so on and so forth.
Okay, thank you very much. And moving on to talk a little bit about, you talked about labor migration in Russia, to Russia. Labor migrants typically are typically employed under poor working conditions, in low-paying jobs that are unattractive to the population. How would you say is this received in the general public? We have had this. My question comes from. Sometimes we have this discussion in a Swedish context, where we find out that migrants are working with poor labor conditions, and then there is a fight about whether the migrants come and they cause salary dumping and things like that. Is that a discussion at all?
Oh yes, a lot. Well, first, I guess you should keep in mind that migrant conditions, situations, so on and so forth, are not the same for all of them, and there are 50 shades of gray. Some people are very well settled, well naturalized. They have residency permits. They're on their way to Russian citizenship. Some of them are married to Russians, and I think their situation is okay. They have full civil rights, and they can send their kids in schools and have access to healthcare, so on and so forth. At the other extreme, you have people that are illegal, that live in big dumps, which are underpaid. Their rights are very severely restricted. Sometimes you can talk about slave labor. Sometimes the travel documents are held by the middlemen who organize that migration, so they're restricted in their ability. So as I said, there is a wide range of situation. Overall, the Russian society, as I said, is by and large skeptical about migration, which is an unfortunate fact of life, although these sentiments are quite common in today's Europe, especially in Eastern Europe, but not only in Eastern Europe. And sentiments of those that you can hear in Russia can be heard here in Sweden as well. For example, in some parts of the country, ethnic Russian parents are complaining that when they send their kids in school, a majority of for elementary school students would be non-ethnic Russians, and the language which is spoken at school is not the Russian language, so on and so forth. So that creates quite a bit of anxiety. And on the one that's on the one hand, but on the other hand, people certainly take advantage of abundant cheap labor, which is available for Russian economy. If this migration was stopped abruptly, then Russia would be in a huge economic crisis, because quite a number of vital industries, and these are the industries which are doing well in the Russian economy, as I said, construction, services, retail, and whatnot, would be brought to a screeching halt.
Are they not taking part in the discussion on this? The companies that are actually dependent on this labor?
No, I don't think. Companies prefer to keep low profile. This cheap labor is extremely useful and efficient for these companies. That's the way to make a profit. And I don't, well, there are some debates, some discussions, but they are not really in the limelight of policy debates in Russia. Lobbying, if anything, occurs behind the closed doors. So you don't see these debates and this public choice process open to the public.
Thank you. Moving on to emigration from Russia, I know you have been looking into this particularly. To what countries would you say do Russians emigrate the most?
Well, depends again. If you're talking about this Russian diaspora at large, Русский мир, as it is known in the Russian world, it's all over the world, and a large number of these people actually have not emigrated anywhere. They live where they lived before, although it was, or their parents lived before. They're natives to these parts, to these countries, because they lived there in the Soviet Union. And after the breakup of the Soviet Union, it was truly a tragedy, because these people all of a sudden found themselves aliens, and oftentimes unwelcome aliens. That's something to be understood, and it was none of their fault. On the other hand, you should also understand, for example, in the Baltic states, the concerns that local ethnic population had about preserving their ethnic identity. In Estonia, for example, let's take the example of the country of Estonia, your close neighbor. In Estonia, I'm not sure my numbers are 100% correct, but before the Second World War, the ethnic Russian population in Estonia, mostly inherited from the Russian Empire, of which Estonia was a part at one point, was I think 6-7%. And before the breakup of the Soviet Union, 50 years fast forward, it was close to 40%. So it was a huge increase of the Russian population, and that became an issue with the Estonian public. But that said, as I said, a large part of these people did, and again, in Estonia, sometimes these people are referred to as migrants. And again, it's not entirely accurate, because, you know, I was born, not myself, but think about someone, I was born in the city of Narva. Why on earth I would be considered as a migrant? You can think about similar sentiments in the, under the breakups of some other colonial empires, such as French in Algeria, for example, right? So this is one part of these people, and still a majority of the Russian world. Then there were big waves of immigration. Large waves of immigration were ethnic. It was the Jewish immigration to first Israel, and many people moved on to some other countries, but many of them stayed in Israel. And that started in the early 1970s. There were fits and starts. And in the late 1980s, when the Iron Curtain, as you mentioned, fell, hell broke loose, and hundreds of thousands of people left very quickly, and now they comprise a large part of the Israeli society and population. There was a sizable German immigration. There was a large number of ethnic Germans living historically in Russia, invited to the country by Empress Catherine II, and so on and so forth. During the Second World War, they were deported to eastern and southern parts of Russia as sort of unreliable aliens, and then they lived there thereafter, and then Germany invited these people back, and also many Jews. So there was a large number of Jews and ethnic Germans coming to Germany. Then, of course, as I said, in the early 1990s, there was another wave of migration, cross-cutting, ethnic Russians, and these people were trying to, you know, to move to what they viewed as the better part of the world, which was North America, Europe, and in fact, Russian immigrants are expanding and exploring the world. Many of them go to Australia, many of them go to South Africa, many of them go to New Zealand, so on and so forth. So it's really global.
Yeah, thank you. I see that Mattias wants to be part of this discussion, but I just have one more question on this topic before that. I think you mentioned a diaspora around 25 million Russian-speaking people around the world.
Right.
Okay. Many other countries in the world that have large diasporas across the world, they develop policies towards these diasporas for different reasons, in order for them to send money home, or in order to pull them together, or in order to sort of attract them back to their home country and to, you know, contribute. Do you have something like that?
Well,
some
yes,
sort of policy?
Right. Well, the Russian government always had some kinds of policies towards the Русский мир, And emphasis and priorities were evolving over time, and some parts of the post-Soviet period in Russia, the emphasis was put on bringing these people back to Russia and helping them to settle, giving them assistance, giving them some real estate, some land to explore, especially in less populated parts of the country, so on and so forth. I think now it's a bit less popular, and now the emphasis is on making sure that people's rights are protected, they're not subject to any discrimination. And also, of course, Russian diasporas are increasingly used as a tool, if not a weapon, in the heightened tension with the West. That aside, I think an important thing to mention is that at least in some countries, Russian diasporas, simply because they're numerous, have become important political forces in domestic politics. And we're certainly talking about the Baltic states. Again, let me take the example of Estonia, which for some reasons I know better than others. An increasing number of ethnic Russians living in Estonia now have Estonian citizenship, and they have full political rights. And those who do not have Estonian citizenship oftentimes do not take it for pragmatic reasons. If they don't have Estonian citizenship, they have a special travel document, which is called a non-citizen passport, which is a great thing because it allows you to work and move freely around Europe, just as if you were a member, a national of Estonia, but at the same time, they are allowed visa-free access to Russia. But a majority of ethnic Russians in Estonia are now Estonian citizens, and because there are so many of them, 25% of Estonian population, how they vote is relevant. In Germany, the number of ethnic Russians living in Germany, not ethnic Russians, of course, Russian speakers living in Germany, is about 2 million. And again, how these people vote is essential, important. In Israel, the number of the Russian speakers is again close to 2 million, the country with the population of Sweden. Oh, actually, a bit less than Sweden, but give or take. And again, these people are becoming an important political constituency. So mainstream politicians, not just so-called ethnic politicians, but mainstream politicians understand that they cannot afford to ignore these people, and they're getting involved in domestic politics. One common feature of this Ruski Mir, which is a little bit perplexing, I don't have a clear explanation, that in fact is a good research question, is that more often than not, these ethnic Russian diasporas in democratic countries are conservative, they're right-wing. And oftentimes, in increasing numbers, they support and vote for a right-wing, sometimes extremely right-wing parties, such as Alternative for Germany, or Our Home Israel in Israel, or whatnot. Many of them, by the way, voted for Donald Trump in the United States. It's an intriguing question as to why this is the case, but there is a whole lot of anecdotal evidence and some statistical data, for example, taken from the European social surveys, that support that on average Russian diasporas are more right-wing, less liberal, more conservative, which is, as a guess, is just a reality.
Thank you.
Very much along the same lines as Minna stopped on, the Russians that are contemplating to emigrate.
Right.
You describe them purely as a brain drain. These are people that Russia would benefit from having in
Absolutely.
Russia.
No doubt
Is
about
there
that.
is there possible brain gain that they do leave, they come back better educated with more contacts, and if so, how is that developed? And if not, what is Russian policy to keep them from emigrating?
Well, I guess brain drain is a phenomenon, is a topic which is well researched by economists, including development economists. And in these studies, there is a phenomenon, a pattern, which is somewhat paradoxically called beneficial brain drain. On some occasions, brain drain could be not such a bad thing for the sending country. And the obvious explanation is that some of these people who have left their home country and spend some time abroad gaining skills, education, knowledge, contacts, and whatnot, they come back and bring all of that home. And in the early 2000s, when the Russian economy was growing, you saw a whole lot of this reverse brain drain going to Russia. People were attracted by the growing economy, by lucrative opportunities. And again, you know, all else equal, home is better than abroad. That's not something I need to explain to any of you. However, there is another aspect of this beneficial drain, and that is about education. Some of Russia's best universities are doing quite well. They're improving their programs. They're raising their academic standards. Some of the leading schools get good funding from the government. And there is a resurgence of popularity of sciences as disciplines that people study. And in general, young kids take serious studies, but many of them, in doing so, are motivated by the prospect to go abroad. Once they graduate from their bachelor program, a master's program, the next step in their career would be to go for a PhD in some European university or in some North American university. And this is more or less a standard career path. If you want to become real professionals, that's what you have to do. But not all of them can do that. And as a result, this is what is known by this beneficial brain drain. The prospects of a better educated person to immigrate stimulates education as such. And on many occasions, these immigration plans do not realize for a variety of reasons, and these people stay. And as a result, this is something that keeps education accumulation of human capital in Russia rising under conditions where it would have not otherwise.
Thank you. We are going to have a few minutes, in a short while we're going to have opportunity for the audience to pose questions, if you have any. So you can sort of start preparing. Very interesting indeed. Do you have any other questions, Mattias?
Yes, even though this is a seminar on Russia, co-organized by the Finns, under the umbrella of the Europeans, my main focus is Sweden. So please link Sweden and Russia migration together. How does that sound?
Well, excellent question, a bit unusual one. I'm not, I'll be off the cuffs, excuse me. I think they are comparable in that the inflow of Ukrainian refugees to Russia, at least numerically, was just about as large as inflow of refugees from Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, and so. So numerically, they're quite similar, although Sweden is 1/15 in terms of population of the size of Russia. I think they're also similar in anxiety, at least in some segments of the society, of this trend, which people think is going out of control. The faith of these refugees in faith, that is not faith too, but faith of these refugees is quite different because in Sweden, although there is quite a bit of sentiments and acrimonious sentiments about migrants and refugees, they are offered very generous support, full welfare, health, housing, whatnot, and those who are fleeing to Russia do not get all of the above. So these people are more or less on their own and have to make do themselves, relying on friends, relatives, good luck, and so forth. So this is definitely a big difference. But one thing to compare, as I said, is that at least numerically, the inflow of refugees in about the same years, by the way, was similar, and response in the society was not entirely different either.
Do we have any questions? Yes, we have one over here. It's on.
Yeah,
Just speak.
hello, Per Retham. I was contemplating an issue you didn't touch upon so much, and that's internal migration due to both climate factors and also global urbanization. And is this an issue, and are there any figures? And if it is an issue, what is the effect on cities versus more rural areas?
Excellent question, sir. Thanks very much for bringing this up. I forgot to mention this, and it's important. One reason for this massive migration of guest workers to Russian capital cities is precisely a relatively low internal migration. Because in Russia's hinterlands, economic conditions are sometimes comparable to those in the countries where these people are coming from. Maybe not as bad, but pretty poor. There are some parts of Russia which are in deep recession, and there are no economic future whatsoever. So it would have been natural for these slots in service, construction, whatnot, filled by these people. But internal migration in Russia historically is pretty low, especially among less educated, less dynamic, less urbanized parts of the society. It's really a single digit, 2-3%. It's much less than you would expect from a country as huge and as diverse as Russia. However, there is a significant migration of younger people, of educated people. And this is almost entirely and invariably from smaller cities to bigger cities, and from the rest of the country to Moscow, and lately also to St. Petersburg. And this is a good sign on the one hand, because these are the places to get the best education, experience, exposure, and develop yourself. But on the other hand, of course, this is a hemorrhage of other regions. And in particular, a region that was losing population quite rapidly of late, and alarmingly so, is the Russian Far East. Which used to be, in the Soviet times, generously supported by the central government for economic, strategic, and so forth reasons. And then it was left to its own devices for some 10, 15 years. And as a result, although there was booming trade and exchanges with the Pacific Rim countries, still this region was losing its population. Which brings me, by the way, if I may, if I have another minute, to mention another thing which was hotly debated in Russia as another migration fear, but which did not materialize, and that was Chinese migration to Russia. In the 1990s, people were concerned and afraid of this invasion of flood of Chinese going to the Far East, where they would outnumber the Russian population, and de facto the Far East will become a part of China, so Russia would lose Far East. That didn't happen. The Chinese migration to Russia has been quite limited so far, and if anything, you can see lots of Chinese tourists in Russia these days, so much so that in the city of Moscow, oftentimes signs are dubbed not only in English but also in Chinese. But there are no reasons to talk and to be concerned about massive Chinese migration to Russia. In fact, the reverse was true. Quite a number of Russians from the Far East, especially people who had some assets to live off, would move to China and live there, collecting their pension, renting out their apartments in the eastern part of Russia. But overall, coming back to your question, Far East is a concern for Russia as a country, because it is losing its most vibrant, most dynamic population. And different ideas were entertained to reverse this trend. One is everyone who would move to the Far East would get a plot of land to cultivate free of charge, but implementation of this idea was not very effective so far, and it has had limited success. So what kind of land? The plan? Oh, a land, plot of land, plot of land.
Thank you very much, Leonid. I know there are a few more questions, and sorry to bring hopes up, but we don't have any more time. But I hope that Leonid will be able to stay a few minutes afterwards, and you will have the opportunity to talk to him. Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Minna. Thank you so much, Leonid. Now, in the last few minutes, we know that a lot of us want to learn more and want to find out where we do go to learn more. And one of the most relevant actors in that field is the Swedish Institute. So, Cecilia Andrei, very briefly, tell us a little bit about what you do and how we can benefit. And please give her a warm hand.
I'm not sure you can hear me yet. Yes, now it's coming along. So first of all, thank you for the invitation to participate. And I will come in now from a bit of a different angle, but I think clearly we can say there are lots of things that are really fascinating about Russia. And I would say we from the Swedish Institute are then a bit fascinated that the interest is maybe not higher than it actually is today to cooperate. So maybe that's the first thing I would like to say. I don't know how many of you that know the Swedish Institute, what we are. Okay, well, a few. After this, I hope you will know a bit more. I will explain a bit about what we are, how Sweden views, the government, the foreign ministry, how they, I should say, view cooperation with Russia today. How is it perceived? What is important, and so on. Why should you cooperate? And what opportunities are there, just briefly. So the Swedish government work, of course, on different levels. I'm not going to go into the foreign policy direction. That's on one level. That's between governments and so on. And I think you're all pretty aware of what's going on there in different fields. We, the Swedish Institute, we're a public agency operating on another level. Usually called, public diplomacy or people's diplomacy. So we're supporting people-to-people contacts. And this is very, very important to the Swedish government, to the foreign ministry. Sweden is in fact one of the countries putting most funding into this in Europe. So there are lots of, but there is plenty of funding, I would say, for people-to-people cooperation. So I would like to stress that's quite important. And the Swedish Institute, we are a public agency under the Ministry for the Foreign Affairs. So we have we dispose of this funding and we use it for different means. But then before saying something about that, because there are maybe some concrete tips and advice that you could use, why should you cooperate with Russia? And I'm thinking then of universities, organizations, business sector, regional level, local level, and so on. We do, first of all, I would say we have common challenges, and some of them have been actually addressed today. Migration could kind of be perceived as a common challenge. Of course, environmental issues, health issues, civil security, and so on. There are lots and lots of common challenges where Sweden, Russia, and not only these two countries, but the Baltics, Poland, Ukraine and so on, need actually to cooperate and should to meet regional challenges. Also, we are quite a small region. We're a region doing quite well, the Baltic Sea region, but we are small on a global scale. And actually, Russia is absolutely part of this region. So we need to address challenges together, also to position ourselves globally, I would say. So there are lots of good reasons. Also, as you mentioned, there are lots of universities doing quite well, and so on and so on. There is a lot of creativeness, interest in, for example, as we talked about, social entrepreneurship and so on and so on. There's a lot of interesting competence, I would say, also, that you can find in Russia. You need to look kind of beyond the headlines, to go on this people-to-people level. And then you will find it, hopefully. So basically, just to conclude, what can you do? The Swedish Institute support individual exchange, if you like, both on an individual level, so you can go there as an expert, for some time, a month more maybe, if you are in a company, an organization, a university, and so on. You can also receive Russian, mainly academic people, I would say, but anyway, this individual exchange is possible to apply for funding. We want to see more applicants, actually. When it comes to that, you can also participate on a more institutional level. So apply for funding as a Swedish organization, together with, for example, Estonia, Russia, and so on, and address, regional challenges. So, for example, the Public Health Agency in Sweden is cooperating with Russian counterparts. The regional council of county of Kalmar in Sweden, cooperating with Kaliningrad on youth issues. There are numerous examples, but of course, there should be more, I would say, also. So those are basically, the two offers, individual exchange and more institutional. And actually, I could say also, Sweden really needs to build up the competence also on Russia, for example, at Swedish universities and elsewhere. In the mid-90s, many people were studying Russian and so on, but there has been a gap, so there's also an opportunity for that. So maybe that's where I should conclude. I will stay on a bit more, and you can ask questions, but you should also contact me and colleagues at the Swedish Institute. Maybe I can, show this, si.se. You can have a look and contact us.
Thank you so much for that, Cecilia. And the reason we had you last, Cecilia, was also because I believe that a lot of the contacts are going to be on an individual basis, asking for project possibilities, and that's why we are organizing a mingle in just 1 minute. Remember, we started 4 minutes late. We're going to end 4 minutes late also. And I want to end up with just 5 top-of-mind things that I myself think that we should develop further our understanding of Russia and Sweden and the relation. The first one that springs to mind is the discussion that we had earlier on this afternoon about energy security and the switch to a low-carbon society and more renewables. It's not a one-way street, thinking more on energy security could actually be not very beneficial to the climate issues. So that's something we really need to understand better, how those 2 or 3 things work together. Secondly, Chloé mentioned the bargaining power, and we heard from several in the audience that trade is indeed positive. So how do we make best use of that? That's a discussion that at least here at Forest is only starting, and I would love for us to develop that further over a glass of wine in just a minute and then in the weeks to come. Thirdly, we only touched upon better integration. I know that a lot of the Russian migrants to Russia are not necessarily well integrated or not necessarily even interested in that, because some of them are just there for some time, but others are. And if there is ideas and best practices to be exchanged there, that's something that we definitely need also in the Swedish discussion. Fourthly, the brain drain or the brain gain. That's something that needs to be discussed not just in a Russian context, but certainly linked to migration from very many other countries. We've been discussing that over the years with, for instance, with foreign aid agencies, but it's certainly something that merits more of our interest and attention, and perhaps also in a Russian context. And fifthly, speaking about Russia and Sweden, in between lies Finland, our 100-year young neighbor. And when we organized this seminar, and I want to have a special round of applause for David in just a minute, who organized a lot of this for us, we found it hard to find Swedish expertise. In line with what you mentioned, there is surprisingly little in terms of Swedish expertise about our big eastern neighbor. Now, when we move to Finland, that's a different story. You have much more interest and much more experience in terms of trade relationship, of security issues, of migration issues, of peaceful and mutually beneficial cooperation. That's something that we'd love to work more with the E2 on, and that's also why I would want to conclude this seminar by thanking the European Liberal Forum for organizing this for us, and especially E2 for taking this initiative. So warm hand of applause to David, who did all of this for us, made it possible, and to E2. Thank you.